I'm Nat, and I work at Exceptional Individuals. We support neurodiverse individuals, so people with like dyslexia, dyspraxia, autism, ADHD, and we help them to be the best they can possibly be, as well as educate the rest of the world to be more accepting. So though we support all the neurodiversities, and there are a lot of them, we are going to be focusing on ADHD today. ADHD in pop culture. I love doing these subjects because essentially we are having a deep dive into how ADHD has been represented in the media, or how people have interpreted the media with ADHD characteristics. Now, it's important to know that a lot of these are speculative because a lot of the time the media will not outrightly say that it was based on an ADHD character, but it's either a remarkable coincidence or completely, obvious. I went down a bit of a rabbit hole today of researching Bert and Ernie because from Sesame Street, because Bert, I'm pretty sure, has ADHD, but also there's other subtexts in their narrative, and it's interesting to see how some people agree, some people do not. You'll know what I'm on about if you know what I'm on about. So without further delay, I think we are good to go. So pop culture, what do we mean by pop culture? Pop culture is just modern popular culture transmitted via mass media. So most people will know what you mean. It's like if you say Bart Simpson, you don't have to be a Simpsons fan to know who we're on about. In the UK, if you say Peggy Mitchell, you'll know we're on about EastEnders, even though you might not watch it. It's about things that most people will have an awareness of and has influenced people's views on the subject. So, like say Star Wars, or Jaws, we're all familiar with it. So I want to start off with a first question. What fictional characters do you think have ADHD? And there's no right or wrong answers on these. These are just characters that you've seen either on film, TV, books, comments, radio, video games, that you're like, you know what? I really resonate with them for one reason or another. And we'll see today how many that I also agree with. Okay, Bart Simpson in one episode, yes. Iron Man, very good. So far, you've got two of what I chose. Tony Stark is a really good one. Okay, anyone else? Roadrunner, brilliant. Bugs Bunny. Finding Nemo, interesting. What a definite Dory, potentially. Yeah, Dory. Deadpool, brilliant. I've got Deadpool as well. That's really great that we've got a lot of similar ones. Jessie from Toy Story 2. I hadn't had that one, but actually I see where you're coming from. Daffy Duck, brilliant. I've got Daffy Duck. We've got some great overlaps here, but also some I've not seen before. Maria from Sound of Music. Yes, Sally. That's one I was researching today, actually. She didn't make the cut today for my list, but I definitely see similarities. Willy Wonka, brilliant. Which version of him? So there's lots of characters which potentially can be, but I'm going to be using the word trope a lot today. So I just want to give you a quick understanding. What do I mean by trope? A trope is a recurring characteristic in media. So for instance, you've got the dumb blonde, the nutty professor, the jock, any sort of pattern that you see throughout. So when we're talking about ADHD, heads up, this isn't all going to be positive. In fact, a lot of it is not. But it's really important to see how the media sees a lot of us, and then it can help us influence change. Because if we do not have the media on our side, we're definitely fighting an uphill battle. A few more. Barney and How I Met Your Mother. Nice, yes. Barney. Okay, we've got some good ones here. Oh, Tigger from Winnie the Pooh. I love Tigger. They are so many animated movies that love representing ADHD. And as you can see, I think that is Hammy from Over the Hedge. Squirrels have an unnecessarily high representation of ADHD characteristics. You tell me a squirrel that isn't. And it will go on today, and it'll be good to know your opinion, how positive or damaging you think any of these potential representations are. But also, if you disagree with me on any of these, please call me out, because I'd love to know your thoughts. The first film we're going to jump into is Robin Williams' Genie. I don't think this applies so much to Will Smith's version, but if you notice, it's just a stream of consciousness. He breaks the fourth wall, so he kind of like talks to the audience. He goes from like doing a Jack Nicholls impression to talking about vintage cars to true love, Shakespearean, animals, all in less than a minute. His mind is like incredibly explosive. You really get the impression that this character, although appears youthful and energetic, has a billion different memories and thoughts flowing through his head. In this instance, I think the Genie is quite a positive representation. And remember, I'm not saying 100% any of these are ADHD, because they obviously aren't, they're cartoons. But were they influenced? Maybe. Robin Williams was neurodivergent, so there's a lot of his personality probably came through into the character. Also, Janice says the White Rabbit in Alice in Wonderland. Yeah, I can see that. Ariel and Little Mermaid. Maybe, possibly. I see a bit of dyspraxia in her too. Okay, these are just a few others, just because honorable mentions. One of you already mentioned Dory from Finding Nemo. I think Dory has a lot of characteristics, but is that due to her short memory loss? Because she also has memory issues as well as potential ADHD, and sometimes it can be very difficult to know what is one characteristic and what is another. You know, it's a tough one. So I wasn't so certain about putting her. I'm not sure many of you would have seen the Lego DC universe, but Supergirl comes across with ADHD traits. They don't come much more focused than me, Cyborg. Oh, look, a kitten. And this is a real typical trope you're going to see time and time again. Oh, look, a squirrel. Oh, look, something shiny. Oh, look, a button. You know, there's always something which like, oh, and it stops a sentence. Really, really typical with ADHD. We've already mentioned Hammy. He's a caffeinated squirrel who's always jittering. There's unfortunately a massive link with being over caffeinated and ADHD, but I am going to touch upon that a little bit more. All the dogs in Up seem to have this squirrel problem where you like, you know, jolting around. And this brings on like interesting question. When we are looking at cartoon animals, are they representing them with animal characteristics, or are they representing them with human characteristics that they believe closely apply? So I don't know. I'm a bit like torn by that, because you don't want to relate all ADHD traits to dogs, but it definitely needs to be noticed. We're going to go through all the different genres I can think of today. There's so many more, but this is just the tip of the nail. What is that? Tip of the nail? Is that the... Yeah. Okay. So first of all, with Garfield, his dog, again, typically all dogs share those traits. Also, the dog from Cat and Dogs. Yeah, I see that. He's actually one of my favorite superheroes or anti-heroes or vigilantes. And it's because he, for me, completely defines ADD, attention deficit disorder. He is a bit hyperactive, but I think I see him more as ADD, because he is always swapping his mind. He's just like the Genie, he's breaking the fourth wall, so he's talking to the audience. He also has a form of insanity, which, you know, you'll notice there is a link between ADHD being portrayed as slightly insane, for better or worse. Probably for worse. ADHDers in media can't maintain focus before getting distracted by a shiny object. What distracts you? Because in the movies, it's always something shiny. You know, we're not magpies, you know, we're not like, ooh, like maybe for some of us, but not all of us. So Sally's bit sound, we've got bright colors, lights, other sounds. My hair feels weird. Yeah. TikTok is distracting. Bright colors, the weather, email, phone notifications, the sun. So I notice a lot of ones here, like in the media, they do shine. So the light reflecting is a typical one, as well as sounds. But as we can see here, it doesn't just have to be these. Like, there's not many movies that I can think of where someone's car headlights have distracted the person with ADHD. But yeah, as we can see here, some of you have mentioned it. We've just got Instagram, YouTube. But do remember, being distracted is a normal part of being a human being. That doesn't mean you'll automatically have ADHD. But if it's something which is a continuous occurrence that has an impact on your day-to-day life, that's when the traits start to like link up with the way you would diagnose it. Oh, someone put sad news in your DMs. That's depressing. Sun, sound, weather, brilliant. So a lot of things can get you distracted. Maybe the media is fairly accurate on this, but they're probably not accurate in terms of the extent. Anxious thoughts, that's another good one. So what are some other comics? If any of you have seen the comics Calvin and Hobbes, Calvin, that boy there, he is often distracted. But what makes him an interesting one is he's often distracted by his internal fantasies. That's why he always has like a talking tiger next to him and always going up to things, where ADHD is typically demonstrated with like a physical distraction or interruption. So I like that one because ADHD doesn't just have to be with physical objects. In Garfield, we mentioned the dog, and chasing a squirrel, that's a double whammy. In Peanuts, your favorite Snoopy, Charlie Brown, in one of the original comics, in the earlier ones, Lucy, she was like a prodigy in golf. And I think something like Charlie Brown says, "You're going to make a great golfer. If only you didn't keep losing interest." And then she goes back to the sand pit, starting building a sandcastle. So in that, it's demonstrating ADHD at a young age. And most of you already know this. When we look at ADHD, we're mostly talking about young children because that's what most of the writers relate ADHD to. But as we all know, it's very much a lifelong condition, and most adults and a lot of us have had it diagnosed in later life. We're going quite fast today, just because there are a lot to get through. In films, so how has Hollywood portrayed ADHD? Now, if you notice here, this picture is quite distressing, can't lie. It's a picture of, is it? Hey, no. My mind's gone blank. Well, it's Venom. Tom Hardy, yes. It's Tom Hardy from Venom. Now, he shows a lot of ADHD traits, quite extreme. However, he is an alien, and he's an alien trying to live a human existence, kind of like navigate the world. So a lot of the time, it's that the alien side him kind of taken over. Not a great analogy when you want to apply it to ADHD. However, that I believe was a consideration when they were designing the character and his mannerisms. Rachel says, as a kid, I always remember looking out the window at school and just completely disconnecting from lessons because a leaf blew and then imagined a whole fantasy daydream from it. I like that. Completely. I am a massive daydreamer. It's one of the reasons I can't drive, just because my mind. Sonic the Hedgehog. I love Sonic because he was born in the year that I was born. And heads up if you can figure that out. But Sonic's great. So he is a blue, furry little critter. And in this one, I'm talking about the movie. Do you know what? The movie wasn't that bad. I actually really like the Sonic movie. And Sonic is super fast, but his attention span moves as fast as his speed. So in the movie, he's like, I'm bored now, are we there yet? Ding, 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 he plays a ball, he runs, he goes all over the place, and he's an absolute hot mess. So this is another continuous trait that we see in movies, a correlation between being really fast and speedy and ADHD. But as we all know, it doesn't have to be hyperactive. You can have ADHD without the hyperactivity. So is Sonic a great example? I don't know, it's up to you really. I think they're only damaging if they give a negative representation to people who have little understanding already. But if you as an individual connects with a character, then it can be a really positive thing. So it doesn't have to be negative. In your humble opinions, how realistic do you think ADHD currently is in the media? You can either say like looking in a mirror, so damn, I totally am connecting how that character is being portrayed. Or it's so extravagated, it's absurdity, and it's nothing like what's going in your mind or people that you may know. Sally says, in large crowds, my mind wanders off a lot. think because I can't connect with the mundane small talk and I'm always imagining something greater than what is in front of me. I think that's why I'm struggling with friendship, especially with people in my own age range group. No, I connect with that. I've had many imaginary friends, particularly in car journeys. I'd always come up with these like creations and I could see them following me around, but they'd quickly poof and come into like new beings. But I really like that we're highlighting that ADHD doesn't just affect external life, it can also be internal in your own thoughts and mind. Okay, interestingly, so essentially, it's some people think it's not completely over absurd. This is interesting and not what I expected. Trevor thinks, as a writer myself, writers draw upon characters they meet, many whom are neurodiverse, but the writers wouldn't be aware of it. That's a really good point, Trevor. I think that's what I haven't thought of before. They might be influenced by neurodiverse, but not necessarily aware that it was neurodiverse that was influenced. Rachel, I also connect with that. I'm really bad at coming up with fantasy scenarios and the mundane will bore me. Darlene, I did the car journey thing too. Nice. It's always good, these sessions, because you realize you're not as alone as you think you are. A few other honorable mentions in the films, and Iron Man, as one of you rightly said, Tony Stark is really eccentric. He's over the top, and that nature makes him zone out. And we do see that a lot of the time with people with ADHD, maybe not so much with the ADD, but where people are very energetic, and as a result, it makes them a little bit eccentric. However, that's typically more in males and females, but there's always examples in both categories for this. The younger sister in Pekka is actually diagnosed with ADHD, when in reality, she just consumes too much sugar. I haven't watched this movie, but I watched clips of it. I'm very torn because on one hand, yes, someone is actually diagnosed with ADHD. We're not guessing. Sometimes you want some real concrete examples, but then they just blame it on too much sugar, which feeds into the narrative that ADHD is not a real disorder. So this is a damaging one for me. Then we got Venom, Shows with Shadow. Oh, yeah, we mentioned the alien thing. I'm hoping by the end of this, you're going to have a better understanding about how the media shows ADHD, but also some good examples, not just negative ones, but it's a mixed bag, so be prepared. Literature. Is ADHD just a new thing? No, it's been around a long time, and this will be proven in an example from The Time Machine. Have any of you ever read H.G. Wells' The Time Machine? I've read the whole H.G. Wells saga. They're great books, easy to read. And this is a direct quote from the book. And I want you to let me know, do you think this relates to ADHD at all? He says, a queer thing I soon discovered about my little hosts, and there was their lack of interest. They would come up to me with eager cries of astonishment like children, but like children, they would soon examine me and wander away after some other toy. And if you haven't watched the film or read the book, in context, he travels to another world. There's these aliens, but they don't quite act the way that he does. And the way that he describes them also really closely aligns to how the DSM, the Diagnostic Manual for Mental Disorders, talks about ADHD. So I found that quite interesting that the official manual and H.G. Wells, who wrote the book long time ago, kind of link up. And also no research suggests, okay, what have we got? Troy says, I think it's a good point that modern day diet can lead a lot of people presenting with ADHD traits. It's true, but you know, if you've got ADHD and someone just says, oh, you know, maybe you should ease off on the sugar, or if you eat a fizzy drink and someone looks at you disapprovingly, that's not great either. There's some research to suggest also modern diet. Speaking of time machines, does the man from Back to the Future have ADHD, the professor? Isaac, yes. We are going to not go into that film, but your answer is yes. There's a stereotype for the eccentric professor. If you think about Doc, Professor Farnsworth from Futurama, you've got Professor Frink from The Simpsons. Most professors, Sheldon, who technically a professor from the Big Bang Theory. There's definitely a trope there. April says, I haven't read the book, but I've seen a 2002 film with Guy Pearce and the singer Samantha Mumba in it. I haven't actually seen that version of it. We always know that, okay, something shiny is represented. Being high on sugar is always represented, easily distracted. But there are other characteristics, even if they're not great characteristics, which the media doesn't show. And you believe if we showed it, it would give a far more honest and realistic representation of what ADHD actually is to a lot of people. The sufficient in the house and some ADHD traits, fraud maybe, yeah. Interesting. I asked my parents why they didn't pursue ADHD as a child, and they said they didn't want me to be associated with it as it was seen as bad in the media and among their peers. Rachel, that is bang on why we're doing today. Absolutely. We are trying so hard to change how neurodiversity is seen in the world, but ultimately people gain their knowledge for better or for worse through mass media. So that is an area that if we don't tackle that at the same time, we're not going to get anywhere. So the first thing that you think is a priority that needs to be shown more is someone loses track of surroundings. Oh no, we've had a change. Open up more with a close friend. I'm really glad that a lot of you put that one first, because ADHD is normally shown as a very basic one trait fits all. You're a scatterbug, your head's all over the place, and that is who you are 24/7. But in reality, we know that depending on the circumstances or the environment, your traits can vary. For instance, being in an unknown environment can cause you to speed up a little bit more, or you might be more likely to have your thoughts just dissipate. But when you're with a close friend in a comfortable environment, some of the symptoms and characteristics and traits can like diminish or be less severe. So that's a really good one to show. Like a track, being very sociable. Some people with ADHD are incredibly social and not in the overbearing way, and equally can be shy. Not all people with ADHD are the life of the party. Some of us just like to take it easy and getting excited about new things. Yeah, I think that's already overdone in the media. Sally says, I can be timid or sociable depending on the situation. Yes, that's great. We are three-dimensional human beings. Trevor says, as a trustee for an adult ADHD support group, I would argue all parents to get diagnosed if they suspect ADHD in a child before they are 18, as adult NHS support is pretty rubbish. I sadly can't disagree with you on that. As for some historical context, we've got Jane Eyre. So her best friend, Helen Burns, shows a lot of similar characteristics to those with ADHD. So actually in the book, it says, I am slatterly, I seldom put and never sleep. Things in order, I am careless, I forget rules, I read when I should learn my lessons. I have no method, and sometimes I say, I cannot bear to be subjected to systematic arrangements. I think this is a really good description of how ADHD can affect someone. More ADD. So when we're saying ADHD, that's attention deficit hyperactive disorder. And when we say ADD, we're referring to it without the hyperactiveness. But just so we're all on the same page, in modern day, ADHD normally includes both ways of thinking, but a lot of people still call it ADD. So I use both terms interchangeably. I remember a right hypocrite mentioned ADHD as a symptom of people as an imbalance of things. Well, unfortunately, there is a lot of misunderstanding. Archaeologist here, so hopefully I'll be remembering right. Oh no, right, Hippocrates. Oh, that's what I get for not reading correctly. Thank you. So some other books, as well as Jane Eyre, is The Jungle Book. The Jungle Book's a nice little book, okay, and it's like essentially two books in one. And the Bangalore log, essentially those cheeky chat monkeys, they show classic ADHD traits, but this does fall very much into the category of distracted dog or hyperactive squirrel. In the book, though, they say something along the lines of, nothing they do lasts for more than 5 minutes before they're distracted. We've also got Percy Jackson and the Olympians. All the half-bloods have ADHD, but the reasoning for that is that their natural reflex help them keep alive in battle as they're always in battle. So this is kind of a good one where they're saying, well, ADHD was actually a very selective process which has had benefits in how that race developed. I don't like calling it a race because we're not a separate race of people, but the fact that there's positive connotations, I like a lot. Okay, Vicky says, about ADD, the ADHD, it is possible that a person may not be physically hyperactive, but their mind still is. Completely agree. So that they may, in the past, have been diagnosed with ADD when they have hyperactivity, just not immediately obvious. Yes, no, that's absolutely possible. And I think that's one theme that's coming up a lot today. But ADHD doesn't just have to be a physical thing. It can also be an internal thing. Now we're moving on to TV. Who doesn't love a good binge watch? As you notice, we've got Sheldon Cooper here. We talk about him a lot when it comes to autism, but there are a lot of overlaps between ADHD and autism. This one I like a lot. The 13th Doctor displays many signs of ADHD. If any of you are big Doctor Who fans, I think all of the Doctors, or at least the vast majority, have traits of ADHD, some more than others. They're all very quirky, they're all very spontaneous, they all have this kind of fleeting mind. But the 13th Doctor in particular, I saw a lot of. And the fact that she's a female, I think makes a really significant input because we don't see ADHD in women, like, ever. So first of all, she's socially awkward, bless her. Just doesn't quite kind of like fit in with how everyone else is talking and communicating. She often goes off on a tangent and you're like, what were you even on about? She expresses a childlike excitement. Rachel says, especially like Matt Smith. I see, yeah, Matt Smith. I think I read somewhere, it's like it's all of the even, or is it all the odd Doctors, the numbers tend to have more stronger traits. What character do you personally resonate with the most? And I remember one of you mentioned about, okay, the professor in Back to the Future. So these are the characters which are normally ADHDers or show characteristics. So we've got the absent-minded professor. That's a really smart, really brainy person who's always forgetful. Sometimes overlaps with kind of like the Alzheimer's, but not always. Then we've got the forgetful Jones. This is just your average, typical person who is really forgetful, like Dory. And you're like, oh, you know, so forgetful. Then you've got the Cloud Cuckoo Lander. That's essentially someone who is, you know, berserk, just completely random. There's no method to their madness, all over the place. And the last one is the easily impressed child. So the child that is just like, wow, you know, and just like maybe like that little kid from Up, someone who is always buzzing. Now, obviously, these are megally overly simplified, flat characters, but they are still characters nevertheless that are continuously used. And I would say sometimes are influenced by ADHD for, again, not always for the best. So actually, most of you are quite well-rounded there. Easily impressed child, nice. Definitely ADHD is part of the majority of Doctor Who incarnations. I like Tom Baker's scatty Doctor. Yeah, no, I like that. And I think maybe not so much with the current Doctor, but with the previous Doctors, I think ADHD, in terms of how their mannerisms are, has been quite a positive thing. Their mind is always jumping around, but it helps them get to the overall solution at the end of it. So I do like the Doctor Who in that. Darlene thinks she's a child, but also the professor. I'm glad that none of you think you're off your rocker. But ultimately, none of these will be any of us because we all have multiple sides of us. But as we know, the media does like to simplify it. Sheldon is often in the middle of a sentence and then he'll be like, oh, he goes, oh, putt, putt, golf. There's so many instances where he's just distracted. He's very intelligent. So again, he would be your classic professor. Then we've got Drake and Josh. So we don't really like Drake and Josh anymore. You'll know if you know. Gets often distracted easily. He's a child. Friends, Joey realizes he should have been at work 2 hours ago. He gets distracted by Chandler. He then sits down again and gets distracted again. Joey is also based on the easily impressed child. The Good Place, Jason is easily distracted. Janet, the kind of like robot cyborg thing, just conjures up something shiny for him. So he's like, oh yeah, that'll keep you occupied. Here's some fireworks. Again, they use a child trope. And as one of you rightly mentioned earlier, Barney from How I Met Your Mother, he said, oh yeah, my teacher said I had AD something, which is the classic joke about, oh yeah, you're saying you've got ADHD while showing you have ADHD. So as we can see from just my brief selection here, we've got the professor a lot. The forgetful one wasn't included that much. We didn't have much cuckoos, but we did have a lot of easily impressed children, even if they're adults. Now for music. This one's a little bit of an oddball here, and you may not have known this one, but System of a Down. They're, according to Word of God, it's like a magazine type thing, a blog. They have desperate screaming in their songs that is intentionally done to mimic the signs of ADHD. And this band are very passionate about ADHD. They also take the stance against pharmaceutical drugging of youth. And as you know, in America, over-drugging is definitely been an issue. Or, you know, I can't speak from personal experience, but I know it's a very contentious issue over there. Their album Toxicity represents the poison of complacency that medication offers. And obviously they relate to ADHD drugs quite a lot. So really interesting, actually, that the album is kind of based around that. There's also a really great Louis Theroux documentary on over-drugging children in the US. April says, one musical performer I know with ADHD is Joya Lucas. I listened to his album ADHD and wrote a blog about it. Do you know, April, I haven't read that blog, but I definitely need to, because I didn't know that one. This one is another one which I do not think a lot of you will know of, is myths, urban legends. I'm reading Lord of the Rings at the moment, and I've gotten really into like lore and legends. So the best one I can think of, and in this one, the Japanese creation myth, mankind has ADHD traits to thank for our mortality. So that's quite a big thing here. Essentially, the reason we die is because of ADHD traits. Ouch. You know, it's like blaming women for eating that apple. Not their fault. It was golden delicious. The legend goes, though, that there's a creation god who wanted to make a human, and he goes to the chief god, and the chief god told him that he needs to make man out of wood. He's like, yeah, mate, make it out of wood. However, he then changes his mind, and he sends an otter of all creatures to update the creation god and says, you know what, mate, use stone. Stone is a lot better. Unfortunately, the otter gets distracted by a sexy young female otter, and, you know, time gets away from him, and the message doesn't get there in time, and man is made out of wood. Now, if man would have been indestructible had he not been made out of stone. So one of the crucial flaws of mankind is, one, trusting an otter, but two, distraction, which I think is really interesting. It's an alternative take on the Christian creation myth. So my art question to you, is Elmo a commentary on ADHD? Is his actions and mannerisms meant to show what ADHD looks like in children? So a lot of you said, can't say. There's a lot of debate I found about Elmo online. And yes, he shows so many characteristics of ADHD. But one common thing which a lot of people overlook and do not take into consideration, Elmo's 3 years old. He's only 3. And that's a common thing which people do not connect, is that there are, you know, ADHD and just being a child, there are some overlaps, okay? And unfortunately, a lot of people get diagnosed ADHD when they're a child, when may not be the truth. It might not be. With adults, maybe it's kind of, if you've had those traits longer than you would have expected, then possibly. So, sorry, Elmo, inconclusive. Board games? Okay, so now you're telling me there's ADHD in board games? There may well be. I mean, am I stretching? Am I clutching at straws now? I think as someone who doesn't see himself represented in media a lot of the time, you'll get what you'll take what you can want. There's an expansion pack or like a subset, and there's this race. Again, race. We've got to stop referring to ADHD people as aliens and a different race, but there we are. The Kenda race, which by the way, everyone hated that race in D&E, embodies ADHD traits. They are very forgetful, they're always making mistakes, but they have a racial ability to detect shiny. So their distraction allows them to find useful things. You can see why this is very problematic. On one hand, it's great that their traits of being easily distracted results into something positive, them finding things and like helping them with their quest. On the downside, however, they're shown as a little bit incompetent and also a completely separate race. Curious to know what if any of you think that's a good or a bad like representation. If you leave him, I'm sure all of you have played Sonic 2. If you leave him like not playing for a while, he gets bored, he starts tapping his toe, he looks at his clock, and he's really impatient. He likes to keep moving. Link can defeat his enemies by waving a fishing pole around to distract him. So not Link, he doesn't have ADHD, but a lot of his enemies, and in fact, a lot of enemies in video games, a lot of Mario ones, a lot of Nintendo games, they show the enemy being easily defeated by distraction. So you can see here, he's throwing his little fishing rod around, and that big baddie, who looks like he could slash him in 5 seconds, is easily distracted by a fishing rod. So as you can see in a lot of video games, the trait of being easily distracted, which is normally what we're referring to when we're talking about ADHD in media, is seen as something which you can overcome, you can beat or use to your advantage, but not in the right sense. In Borderland 2, Tiny Tina, she goes, oh, counting down, 10, 9, 8, and then she fires a missile and it blows up the train. She's like, I got bored. And, there's your classic, I'm a bit dumb, I'm a bit scatty. So not a great representation. We then got in Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, the original, not the brand new one. I haven't played that one yet. Your rival comes barging in your door and he's talking to you and you're like, whoa, mate, what are you doing in my bedroom? And he's like, oh, a brand new computer, and completely changed subjects. And then Sonic, as we mentioned, still stands still. You're probably getting the pattern now, right? It's starting to get a little bit repetitive, but it shows you how the one aspect of like an ADHD trait is duplicated time and time and time and time and time and time and time again. We're not really showing a very three-dimensional like view of someone who might have attention deficit hyperactive disorder. And I'm not saying that all these people do have ADHD, by no means. A lot of them are cartoons. But what I am saying is that if we do not show the characteristics in their entirety, all around, we're not really painting the best picture. Because if you go up to a stranger and you say, oh, I've got ADHD, if the only thing they think of is Tigger from Winnie the Pooh or Sonic the Hedgehog, they're going to completely underestimate your ability, and it might in turn affect how they respond and act around you. Cartoons are represented as ADHD more than any other type of media. Why? Because ADHD is funny, apparently. It's funny to be forgetful. It's funny to be distracted. It's funny to make careless mistakes. So Adventure Time. Why is ADHD represented poorly in pop culture? So this is another question I'm asking all of you. What do you think is the biggest reason it isn't represented in a more accurate and positive way? Is it mostly a misunderstanding? People just getting their wires crossed? Not really like, that's not meant to be ADHD. You shouldn't interpret it as that. Is it that it's oversimplified? That's far too basic and doesn't go into the nuances. Or maybe they've over-exaggerated and they made it seem way more severe and debilitating than it actually is. Is it just because it's funny and, TV likes funny? Or is it something else? So we've got at the moment, and most of you think it's an oversimplification or an exaggeration. It probably is. Well, it is a combination of all these things. And some of these are going to be harder to overcome than others. Like, can you still be funny and not make fun of ADHD? Can ADHD be a funny thing, which is still positive? Can you explain a complicated process and not bore people on TV? Do we need people who have Z condition or disorder to be the writers when writing about those characters? We often say like the voice actors now or characters have to be like Apu, the new voice actor is Indian, for example, in The Simpsons. I think only the person with the condition should be allowed to be funny about it, assuming they choose to. But then what about if someone associates with being ADHD or aren't diagnosed but very much likely has it? Where do we draw the line of when it's acceptable, when it's not acceptable, who's acceptable? Like, if you're the mother of someone with ADHD, do you have an opinion? Or is that not at all? Okay, let's start rounding up. BoJack Horseman, Mr. Peanutbutter. Being a dog, he's easily distracted. Back to the classic dogs. I personally think we should move away from resonating too much with like dogs and squirrels. But yeah, ADHD characteristics are often associated with dogs, squirrels, or kittens. Animals that are really hyperactive, continuously getting distracted. Rachel says, yeah, the lines of what funny and offensive is very blurred and very much applies to the individual's reactions. That's a very detailed answer. I'm a massive fan of South Park, which is probably one of the most offensive TV shows on TV. But maybe it's because they do it to everyone rather than just one section of the population. Cats, especially kittens. Monkeys, nice. I was always associated with being a monkey as a child, and I never saw anything negative about it. Sunjan says ADHD or ADD experts and individuals should advise writers for popular fiction. Totally agree. Netflix, give us a call. Bart Simpson, we've already mentioned. Bart Simpson was actually diagnosed with ADHD and put on drugs. The episode mainly focuses on the side effects that made him paranoid. Great, he's showing ADHD. The fact that Bart was diagnosed, I'm a big pro for, but we've got to stop showing ADHD medication as a bad thing. For some people, medication is like essential to living a functioning life that they're happy with. Not for all, but for some. So yes, Bart, I like that you're ADHD. I'm not a fan that you made it seem that medication makes you go do la la. Rachel says ADHD has more addictive personalities. So I just wanted to ask you, how realistic is it? If you've got ADHD or you know someone with ADHD, are you obsessed with coffee? Do you love it? Or do you prefer to avoid any kind of caffeinated drinks? Or are you addicted to something else? This is anonymous, by the way. Or none of that is really your thing. And you know what? Either of them is fine. I just want to make sure that, how realistic is it that people with ADHD are more inclined to have drinks or substances which will exacerbate their distractions or characteristics? This isn't a very, I hate coffee, but like diet soda. So some more animated TV shows that we may have missed is Arthur, the boy who has his head in the clouds. George is dyslexic in that episode, but he displays so many characteristics of ADHD as well. Could he have a comorbidity or co-occurring condition? Kim Possible's boyfriend is the poster child for Hollywood ADHD. Hollywood ADHD is just your standard, oh, look, it's shiny kind of person. King of the Hill, Bobby is mistakenly diagnosed with ADHD and prescribed drugs. Again, just like Bart Simpson, not a great one. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Michelangelo, easily distracted, a definite contender. And in The Mask, he declares that he's going to save the day, but then he gets distracted. So just some really great examples, which may or may not be, but enough to get you thinking. But if any of you have any questions, statements, or rebuttals, anything that you want to say in defense of, now is a good time to let it know. Vicky needs to leave now, but great you could come here. Very thought-provoking. That's the main one. George is tested with dyslexia in the same episode of Arthur. I don't think of him as having ADHD up until now. I reckon go watch it back and have that in your mind, thinking, does this apply? Yes, I often rely on it to focus me. Seems to be such a thin line between falling asleep from it or completely distracted. Great talk. Okay, nice. Well, I think that sounds good. If there are no questions today, and to be honest, it was quite a lot, I will see you at the next one. Yes, it was great to finally watch these lives. Yes, Rachel, always great to great to have you. Hopefully you can come again. And if any of you are neurodiverse and struggling in the workforce or struggling to get a job, do get in touch with us. We might be able to help you out with some funding, mentoring, teaching. We're a social enterprise, so everything we do for individuals is free. And if you're working in a business, we can always partner up with you. We do a lot of that as well. Thanks, Trevor. Thanks, Vashnishna. Sorry about the name. Sally, thank you. Sunjan, thank you. Rachel, great. I really appreciate it. Bye, everyone.